Welcome to MOTS, where we'll be applying the Manzer or Mosi-Thurlow scale of quantitative analysis of pop culture narrative through a binary system.
Or MOTS! This podcast contains spoilers, mature content, and language. Viewer discretion advised. Hello, and welcome to the final movie in the Bon Mots Oscar Best Picture Nom Marathon. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Scott Thurlow.
Hello.
And Stephen Hermosi.
Hello.
And tonight we are doing Room. Not The Room, but just Room. So, Scott, would you like to give us even though this is a tradition dictates that we do this, although this movie really shouldn't have a funny log line, would you like to give one?
It's going to have one because, yes, I try to bring some levity to anything we're doing, regardless of the subject matter. So for this one, I came up with, as broadly as possible, it's Plato's Cave, dark movie style.
Very true. Now I'm going to give an actual synopsis of this film. If you haven't heard of this, this is a pretty dark film about a woman and her child who have for the past 7 years, well, the kid is 5 years old, and she for 7 years has been trapped in a garden shed by a rapist who keeps her there, and the kid has grown up in this environment, never having seen the outside world except through a skylight.
That's why I said Plato's Cave is all it's gone.
And also all the concept of
Sure.
the reality and all that. So all of his interactions with the world are basically through television, which he doesn't even understand the difference between what is real and what is not, but we'll get into that later. They end up escaping about halfway through the film, and the rest deals with the repercussions of this tragedy, not only to the mother and the son, but to the family who, after all of these years, have rediscovered their daughter. And it's kind of a rather reaffirming and warm story at the end, but I guess we'll discuss that.
I don't know about that, but
Nonetheless, we're going to delve in depth now with the introduction. So, Scott, would you like to start?
all right, yes. So it opens on it's Joy Newstrom is the woman's character's name, who's being held in the garden shed, and it's her son Jack's 5th birthday. And it opens on them, going through their daily life and the horrible existence they live in the little garden shed, which is, to Jack, of course, his entire reality. And Joy has done her best to raise him within, the harsh conditions imposed on her by this situation. And so let me ask you guys, I'm trying to parse out exactly where I think the body, or the intro ends and the body starts, because we were discussing this during the film.
Mm-hmm.
It's really difficult to me. I think maybe I'll make the case that the intro concludes when Jack enacts Joy's plan to escape, to call for help. He actually gets to the outside world through a plan of hers. She tricks old Nick as the man keeping them captive. What she does is make him think that that Jack is dead, thus forcing him to bring Jack, what he thinks is Jack's body, to be disposed of while Jack, of course, is still alive, and he escapes out of the car that he's being transported in and runs for help to the first person he sees.
I think that's so that's kind of what I was going to say as well. It is really far into the movie when this happens. It's probably
40 minutes,
almost
maybe.
Halfway, yeah.
Approaching that.
And the thing is, I think that there could be arguments made for the intro ending earlier than that.
And there will be.
But for me, that's kind of when it's
that's
tough.
Act 1
it's
to
tough
me.
because it's not really an introduction anymore to the two main characters of this, Joy
Sure.
and Jack, anymore. But that part is the part where they kind of figure out that they have actual lives to be lived.
Sticking to my logline, that's when he escapes Plato's Cave, so that's sort of why I want to call it there.
That's an interesting argument that I like, but I'm actually much earlier in this.
Okay.
Upon the introduction, or right after the introduction of Old Nick, who is the rapist that is keeping them captive.
See, I don't, that's a valid point. It's just that, to me, that's the intro I just said is where it is, but go on.
Because here's my argument for that. Up until then, you know something's wrong here. And again, coming into this movie, if you know the plot line, then you know what all of the conflict
Sure,
is.
you have the history.
But they don't really identify why they're in here. It's actually kind of because the protagonist of this is not the mother, it is the son. and you're seeing it through his reality. So he doesn't know that there is anything outside of this world. So you almost get introduced to this through his innocent eyes.
Sure.
And upon old Nick coming in, you actually see it starts the conflict,
the reality of
in
the
a way.
situation. Yeah.
And I think that at that point you can say that this is where the actual conflict is set up, because you begin with that innocence, and then that again it's innocence lost for the audience at that.
I think both of these are valid, and I was sort of coin flipping myself. You can make a case for both of those being the cutoff point. But in my mind, having seen the full movie, I'll stand by what I said. But what you said is perfectly valid, too.
And Steve, I think you're the tiebreaker here.
So this is an interesting thing, because I think this is the most difference that we've seen in the intro in maybe any movie that we've done so far.
It's the nature of the film, sure.
It's a very big difference. And where we decide that ends is going to have a lot to do with how we score the body. I said this early on, which may influence why I'm going to probably agree with Scott on this. But I said early on that, like, once they get out of this place is when the real story actually begins. You know, before having seen the rest of the movie and not realizing that it's a good 45 minutes before they actually get out of the room. So I'm probably going to stick with that and go with Scott on this. Not that, not that you don't have a good point, Ian, but that's kind of where I saw it while I was watching the film.
I will allow that to be then. I will acquiesce to your vote.
Quite gracious of you.
So, but then if that is true, I would like to explore a little bit more of what happens.
Sure. I just want to add that, again, yeah, you're right. It's difficult to cut some of this up because traditionally you could call what you just said, sure, that's a fine place to draw the line in introduction. It's just that the nature of this plot, I think perhaps you might have to sort of rethink it in those terms.
I actually think we're going to have a similar problem when it comes to dividing the body and the conclusion.
I mean,
as well.
I could see that being the case, sure.
I would agree.
So if the introduction is the entire part that takes place in the room, which I think is a good, hour and a half or so?
It's at least 45 minutes, probably more than that.
So as Scott pointed out earlier, you're seeing their daily lives in here, exercising, trying to eat. The fact that their lack of sun, lack of nutrition. At one point, Joy pulls a tooth out because her teeth are rotting. And you have this guy, and I love his introduction as a character, Old Nick, because you see, when he comes in to rape his victim, you see again through the child's eyes, and he is locked in this sub room.
Not only
closet.
that, he's in the wardrobe,
yeah.
viewing it through the slats in the
you
closet.
don't see Old Nick, and you just see his shadowy figure in the distance, and you hear his voice, and it's in a way they do an interesting thing, which he's always kind of threatening, but you see kind of like a pathetic creature. He's not as menacing when shown in the light of day.
Of course.
And so, as you pointed out, they do an escape. She first tries to fake that Jack is sick so he can be taken to the hospital, but Old Nick isn't going to take that risk. So then she wraps up her son in a carpet, saying that he died because of the illness, and puts on an act in order to sell that the son is dead, and he takes the body, and that's when Jack escapes. Mm-hmm. So that's all fitting for the conclusion there?
Yeah. I mean, drawing the line where I said, I'm going to give it a 1. And I think even if we drew it where you said, I think I would still give it a 1.
Yes.
I would agree. I'm going to give it a 1 as well. And I guess I would like to say that I think that the actors in this do a good job of selling that they're trapped in a room. Like there's a very good.
It's believable for sure. Yes.
Yeah, there's a very good, I guess, patter between the Joy and Jack. The mother and the son. That kind of leads you to understand their relationship as mother and son, but also understand that they're trapped there against Joy's will, and that Jack, this is all he's ever known, which I thought was really interesting.
I thought was even more interesting was her attempts to explain to Jack that this reality is false. Mm-hmm. Something he's believed his entire life, that this is it. That the stuff he sees on television, some of it's real, but most of it's like squirrels, I think he says, don't
it's coming from outer
exist.
space, yeah.
And there's nothing outside the room. And that actually Old Nick is magical and materializes goods for them.
Right.
So her attempts and his resistance to that. Now, granted, I'm not a huge fan of child actors. Sometimes insufferable during the opening scenes, but I really bought their relationship as mother and son.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll agree with that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think perhaps in a similar way to The Exorcist before Linda Blair gets, the demon inside her. Like, it's kind of, I don't know, just saccharine at times, but it's still, a believable, back and forth between them.
I've seen The Exorcist 137 times, and it keeps getting funnier every single time I see it. Anyway.
So one's all around
Yes.
the introduction?
I think one's all around, yeah.
All right, then I'm going to continue with the body. So first, when does the body end?
I would say...
When does the conclusion begin?
Oh, okay. All right. I got you.
I actually wrote this down because here's where I was thinking, because I'm going to have to do the conclusion, so I was trying to figure out where I was going to pick that up from. I think the interview, right after the interview, is where it ends. Directly after that is where she tries to commit suicide.
Yeah.
And I think that's the whole beginning of the conclusion.
I agree. I was going to say suicide attempt, so it's close enough.
Right.
Yeah, that split second between the two. So I will... So
yeah.
Jack ends up escaping. A stranger walking his dog ends up actually saving his life because he sees and realizes that the child's in danger. And old Nick realizes
Flees
that
in
he's
terror.
caught, so runs. And again, remember this. It's very interesting is they do a great job of the fact that reminding you that Jack has never met anyone outside of two people his entire life.
Right.
His entire world is shattered at that point.
He's
and
obviously terrified of like everything in the outside world.
Shocked and traumatized.
Sure. Yeah.
But the police end up figuring out that and end up getting the mother out. So they return home. She got abducted when she was 17. So in a sense, you're dealing with two children here.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah.
Dealing with this trauma. And her parents got divorced. Her mother remarried.
Or is living with someone else at least.
Or something.
We can split hairs over that, but anyway, that's the situation at large.
And basically it deals with both the traumas of the son trying to become an
come to
adapt
terms
to this world.
with reality. Yeah.
The mother just destroyed from her experience, and you deal with how that one action affected every single person in that world. The parents' marriage fell apart. It was implied because of this event. Mm-hmm. So it's very well done, and the son, because he's 5 years old, has the ability to, I guess, you slowly see his development. It's a very believable.
He has to relearn reality, essentially.
But not only that, but learn to trust people again. And you slowly see it, and I think that was incredibly well done. And the mother is having a tough time adjusting. And eventually she decides to move, that she wants to move out, and she needs money, and she'll do an interview. And she's confident in that until the reporter starts asking too many tough questions, including, don't you think it would have been better to convince old Nick to have left the baby on the hospital doorstep instead of keeping him isolated?
Trying to raise
she
him
thinks that
in
she's
the
trying
room,
to be a
yes.
good mother.
Right.
She thinks of all her failings as a mother, and it's very tough and very traumatic, and dealing with all of those elements. And I think it was very interesting.
Yeah, I'm gonna probably go back to this when we get to style, but it's a really visceral experience the entire time. Right. There's so much care put into the experience of finding new things and learning new things, especially from Jack's point of view. He's seeing all these things for the first time. He's feeling and doing all this stuff for the first time, and they do a really good job of filming that. And that comes through in the body. In his experience, a lot of the body is about his experience of the outside world, and I think that they do a very good job of explaining that to you.
I agree with that, but I'm going to apply it to not style, but another question that we'll answer later. But I definitely agree with it.
Yeah.
So, anybody else have anything to say about it?
I do, but I'm going to save it. I think the same place you are.
The number of points that, yeah, sure.
So, because it's really very thematic, and not again. I described what happens, but that's not the narrative
it's a
is
surface.
not important here.
Sure.
It's what they're trying to address. So I'm going to give it a 1 because I thought, oddly enough, when it switched to this point, I thought this would grow boring. But I think this is actually the strongest part of the movie.
We thought it would take a downgrade, but in
Right.
fact, it carried itself and had some better points to make.
Yes, I'm going to give it.
It absolutely did. That's probably why it raised itself to being Oscar worthy. I'm going to give it a 1 as well.
Yep, me too.
So 1 all around.
Yep.
And now, Steve-O, bring us home. Conclusion.
All right. So the conclusion begins. At least I'm going to say, as I said earlier, directly after the interview that she has to face all these tough questions. They lead Joy, the main character, to question kind of the choices that she made while she was a captive, and that leads her to try to commit suicide. And she kind of goes away for a little while, and you kind of see Jack integrating himself into society a little bit more through his grandmother, Joy's mother, and her Leo, her mother's new lover.
We're going to refer to him as Uncle Leo
Yeah.
to again to try to bring some levity to it, but
so Leo is really the first one that kind of gets Jack to come out of his shell a little bit.
yeah, that's a good point.
I think that was still during the body, actually,
Yes.
before the interview.
It certainly was.
It definitely bears mentioning. He kind of gets Jack to come out and have a bowl of cereal with him and talk a little bit and all that stuff. So throughout the conclusion, Jack's kind of going through all this without his mother there because she's in the hospital or whatever, and he makes a friend, which is kind of the only part of this movie that really comes out of left field. There's just a kid at the back door at some point. I don't know where he came
but
from.
It seems that they're a pretty small
It's implied
community.
that yeah. I mean, yes,
I get that, but
agreed that it seemed a little abrupt to introduce that, but it wasn't so jarring that I disbelieved it.
It wasn't terrible. I'll give you that.
Sure.
But he makes a friend. He meets his Leo's dog Seamus, and he kind of figures himself out a little bit. And then his mother comes back and he asks her if they can go back.
Before you say what you're about to say, we were waiting for this the entire movie if we thought it was going to happen within the movie.
Yeah.
So Jack asked Joy if they can
go back to room.
Yeah, but it was a nice subversion on that because I thought that he was going to want to go back to
Stay there. And...
Yeah, I thought he was going to
his
reject
comfort
his
zone, essentially.
Yeah,
sure.
Right.
But it would go on because it wasn't what.
Well, he kind of accepts being gone and wants to go say goodbye. It seems, and he
wants to put it behind him, essentially.
And it goes back to a part earlier in the very beginning of the movie. He's saying good morning to everything in the room. At the end, he says goodbye to everything in the room, and then they kind of walk away, and that's the end.
Good night, room. Good night, moon.
Good night, moon.
Anyways, sure, yes, that's all valid.
Oddly enough, and I don't know, I'm no child psychologist or anything like that, but I'm going to make declarations here.
All right.
There was an interesting thing that the mother had to leave in order for him to finally become adjusted. Maybe it would have happened anyway.
I was waiting to speak somewhat about that in themes, but it certainly stands.
So I thought that was an interesting. I'm not qualified to make, but I noticed that, and it was an interesting little.
Yeah, no, I certainly I did notice that myself. I thought about it when it was happening, and I agree with it. It was a nice little touch. Sure.
Yeah, I think that, and I think that going back at the end, because this happened at the very end. This is the last scene in the movie. Really tied the whole film together.
That room really tied the room together.
The room tied the room together. But it was a good, bookend to the beginning of everything.
This is also, I know you weren't there for it, Scott, but Brooklyn, when she goes back to Ireland and can't go home again, it's kind of I know it's a completely different thematic.
Well, it's kind of an inversion of that.
Yeah, it's going back to your childhood.
That sentiment is so prevalent that it could be applied to both, even I haven't seen that movie, sure, but
there's a lot of weird subversions in this.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to give it. I don't know much else to say about this.
No. I mean,
there's not much to say, but it was a fairly short conclusion. But it didn't have to be more than it was. Actually, it wasn't actually that short. But
I think it was perfectly paced.
Happened.
In fact,
yeah, I thought it was very well paced as well. It didn't. We have done at least one other movie that seemed like it dragged on at the end.
No, this movie was exactly as long as it needed to be.
Yeah,
and I think that that's a credit to it.
I would agree. I'm going to give the conclusion a 1.
Yes.
Same here.
Mhm.
So that is 1s all around. So the structure of this movie was fantastic. Now, Scott, let's talk about themes.
I will try to be as professional, or at least as understanding as possible. Of course, yes, you can bust my balls, Stephen or Mosi, as you always do, but I think you would have to somewhat agree to an extent in that it's humanity's, again, dark side. Humanity being a monster, right? As represented by Old Nick.
Yeah. Well, I would say that...
That's one theme, for sure.
Right.
Right? So it's basically, that's the framework of it. Right? Joy's backstory is that she was abducted, she was 17, and then been captive for 7 years, and so forth, yes.
My one challenge to that, though, is while I agree in another movie that would have been the main
That's why I'm getting to it.
But it's almost that they acknowledge it, saying that this needs to be acknowledged because it's part of the story.
Right, but it's not
but
the
we're
main
moving
point
it
of it.
aside
Sure.
And looking at other things. So.
Right, of course. Yeah, of course I agree with that. I just had to say that because I'm always going to say that about the, sort of fold it into antagonist. But the real theme, of course, is sort of questioning reality. What you think reality, or what you're told reality is, what you're shown reality is, versus what it, in quotes, what it really is,
Right.
and as framed by the situation that these characters find themselves in, or forced into, essentially. So I think that, of course, was one of the big ones, and also dealing with traumatic events was a big one. It's sort of, again, doubly enfolded into it. Mm-hmm.
I think a big theme in this also was the learning, basically the complete rebirth of Jack.
Sure.
And I think
Well, that's what I'm saying.
I think that was a big one, a big part of it. Like, this was all of him learning how to be a person.
Yeah.
That was the entire point.
Well,
of
that's me.
this.
That's why, again, I can't help but make the Plato's Cave connection, because
Right.
it was that was a major theme within the theme that they're going for.
To the point of reality, though, yes, you're right. But to the point of rebirth, they do some heavy-handed.
Kind of.
They do.
They do some obvious
they
things. Yes.
Like his birth. He even mentions that the constant thing about being born. When he gets back, it's a complete the whiteness, and he's blinded by the light. And
yes.
there's a lot of. I don't think
there are many not so subtle inclusions.
I've seen far worse in other movies, but I definitely think that stylistically they were intending to have that message.
I mean, I agree that obviously it was true, but I think they were handled well. Yeah. Is what I want to say about that.
And I don't think that they did. You say heavy-handed. I don't know if it was heavy-handed. I think that whole adjusting to light and all that stuff was, yes, an obvious metaphor.
That's
but
physically also true.
Was what would be happening.
Yeah,
to
that's
him.
what I mean.
At
But
the time, you kind of have to include that.
His first speech that Jack gives, I believe he references being born, going through that she cut the cord.
Oh, yeah, right.
That kind of stuff.
He did say that. Yes.
There is that element in there, and again, it's not too prominent, but I think it was there was definite intention there.
Yeah, of course there was. But if I may make a point that sometimes you overuse the phrase, the description of heavy-handed. It's in other movies we reviewed, I think that's more applicable than here. However, I still think it's quite obvious what they were going for. I'm not sure if I agree with Steve-O in the sense that I'm not sure if I would describe it as heavy-handed. It was just very intentional.
If I had said it as heavy-handed,
yeah.
I don't think it was my intention to. Sure. I said that it was intentional, but not subtle. But it was.
We'll argue about this.
Right. It was there.
We'll have this discussion in Neophytes of Narratology. Check that out philosophically. But
no, there is an element, though. You mentioned trauma earlier, and they actually do a very, very well handled.
I agree.
On how it affects every single person, but without being.
That was not overdone. I think it was very realistically depicted.
Yeah.
In that sense.
Yeah. They have William H. Macy is in this movie for 10 minutes
at max.
Yeah. He plays her father, and he can't even look at Jack because he's the son of his his grandson's the son of a rapist.
Disturbed by the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So it's him dealing. There's so many. It's subtle at times and well crafted, and you see how well intentioned people can get in the way when dealing with trauma, how people can. Again, I'm not really trained to discuss the aspects of trauma, but from experience, this was one of the best ones I've seen.
I really enjoyed and you guys are right, they did have a lot of thematic things that were going on in this. I do, if I have to have one nitpick, I do wish they had gone a little bit more into what was going on with William H. Macy's character, the grandfather, just because I kind of wanted to know what he was thinking, why he couldn't look at the kid, and why. I
think you can understand why, but you wanted more of it.
I wanted to
delve deeper,
a little bit more into the psychology of that.
Everyone wants more William H. Macy.
But again,
that's also true.
Well, we made this facetious point that perhaps they could only afford him for that amount of time in the movie, so therefore he was shipped on a bus, essentially. But no, I mean, of course, agree. It's legitimate that they could have explored that aspect more if they wished to. Maybe, clearly they just didn't.
But that was necessarily.
It would have been an interesting plot thing, but wasn't necessary. No. I put forth you that it wasn't quite, so it was fine the way it was.
That's why it was a minor nitpick for me. That would have been interesting, but I understand that it wasn't the point of the film. The point of the film was to follow Joy and Jack's story.
So having said all that, I don't really have much else to add. I'm going to give it a 1, certainly.
I'm giving it a 1 as well.
I would agree, yeah. They dealt with the themes really well in this.
All right, and I'm on to antagonist. Now, it would seem obvious that old Nick is the antagonist, but I really don't think it qualifies for the entire movie.
Well, he's a sub one, of course, but if you will.
Because I think they really take away his power at a point. Not to say to delegitimize the terrible things he's doing, but he's not a... He's more pathetic than he is monstrous.
That's perfect description.
Yeah.
So the antagonist is kind of the traumas of life.
Yes. I was going to say something very similar to that, and I think that's valid. I think that is the antagonist, at least set up as such in the film.
But it's definitely darker than that. It's not the traumas of life. It's the traumas of...
Caused by the darker side of humanity.
Of this type of thing happening to you, and this is similarly dealt with even in, I would say, like war films or anything that there's like a really very, very traumatic thing that happens to the main character. It's not like a these are the things that happen in life. It's like these are the worst things that could happen to you.
Well, I didn't really know how to describe it. So I agree, my description fell short of my intention, but you described it very well.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I figured that's...
Good add-on, my friend, yes. But sure, I mean, I think all that is completely valid, and I think it was handled well. Yeah, like, surfacely, Old Nick is the, in quotes, antagonist, but really it's about, you're right, dealing with an extreme situation that isn't, that's, of course, not common, but nevertheless exists as a possibility, and people have had to deal with it. And the movie explores how to handle that,
but also
or how they might.
Also, the ripple effects of a situation like
that.
Mm-hmm.
You're right.
That it's not just
the core
Joy
characters,
and Jack, who were, even though yes, they felt the trauma, but everyone else in their life, it rippled out to.
If you will, it's they're like ground zero, but the shockwave spreads out to their family and others who are connected to it.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. That's very well put. It's kind of the idea of this destroyed life that affects everyone, despite the fact that specifically Joy has a scene where her mother says, "Do you think you're the only one whose life was destroyed?"
I was waiting for you to point out that line.
And she says, "Yes, I do, because
I'm the one who lived it."
She actually lived through it, but that doesn't mean how much her parents' life was completely ruined by this.
It's not to say that they were unaffected at all, of course, just to a lesser degree. But regardless, it was still there.
So I thought it was very handled incredibly well. The craft of this movie, especially the second half, was extraordinary with dealing with trauma. So
usually we sometimes look this up or not, but we didn't look up the writer. I believe the script writer for this film.
But I think it was
whoever they or he or she maybe I think did a great job of I want to say towing the line, but that's not quite what I mean to say. Sort of enfolding it, handling it very maturely without pandering, but showing real aspects and real repercussions of it.
Not getting overly emotional or sappy about it, and just kind of showing what this is like.
Sure, it's an unflinching look at it, but it's nevertheless is very realistic and quite well handled. That's all I can say about it. So I'm certainly giving it a 1.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to give it a 1 as well.
I actually have one last thought on that before we move
Sure.
on.
Yeah.
I think that the scene with the reporters in there really exemplifies how the difference between what the intention of this movie was, which is to give a really realistic portrayal of the ramifications of something like this, and how, in a sense, the media uses it. I guess not
Society
the media,
at
but like,
large.
generally, film will use trauma in order to not glamorize it, but to spotlight it and to
sensationalize
Yeah,
it.
sensationalize, perfect word for that.
Right.
So there is this very kind of down to earth discussion, a very real, sober discussion of trauma in this, and again, that's just the last. I think they went.
Sure. So another little extra aspect that they had in there, and which sort of elevated it. It certainly could have been handled a lot more poorly than it was.
Yes.
I think what was there, they did a great job of, again, unfolding all those little nuances of the trauma at large
Absolutely.
into it.
Okay, Stephen Ormosi
I'm going to start
with
with
protagonists.
protagonists. And I think you're right. The main protagonist of this film is Jack. You kind of see the world through
I don't know.
his eyes.
Well, go ahead.
I think that's a big part of why the reason that this film is so visceral, and you almost feel the things that he's feeling when he
I agree
steps
with
out
that.
of the bed and like puts his feet down on the ground. Like you kind of feel this new ground or like this tile under his feet, and
Sure.
there's all these like points where he's feeling something new. And that's why I would say that Jack is the main protagonist. I would say that Joy is also a protagonist, but lesser of one. So as much as you get to feel the new world for Jack, you kind of get to feel emotions through Joy.
Yes. So
I would say Jack kind of has like anger and love, and I don't know, that might be about it.
Frustration.
Fear.
Yeah.
But given what you just said, I think that qualifies as almost a dead even 50-50 split. You get
No.
that's how I'm just going to make my case. Yes, everything you said about seeing the action, the experiences through Jack's eyes is true. So you get like sort of the childlike, innocence, if you will, whatever innocence he has at that point, has up until that point, but also through her adult experiences, or again, of course, more mature than him. So you sort of get both perspectives, I think, on it. So you get both sides of trauma, if you will, as we were just saying.
But you still see all of the adult trauma through.
Not
you
only
always
through his
are-
eyes,
You're
though.
always following him. You see when she's fighting, when they get back home and she's
Yes,
fighting with the mother.
you're right. I mean, that's true.
you see
him
it's
with
him watching the fight and hiding from the fight.
Yeah, no, I get
when
it,
she
but-
commits suicide, you're not watching her commit suicide. You're watching him find her.
Yeah, that's
On the
all
floor.
true, but
Yes, she plays an important role, and I would even grant it. She's a protagonist, but it's
They're not even?
definitely hit, I would say 70-30.
you might have maybe convinced me about that. Let's call it 60-40, 60 in Jack's favor. But I mean, it's close because I mean they're mother and child, so they have, of course, that connection, that relationship. And again, all I'm saying is like the film does a good job of showing you both perspectives and again repercussions and consequences. After after their situation has come to a head.
I would say, to actually back you up, Ian, on this, when she tries to commit suicide,
She's gone from
she
the film. Yeah,
disappears from
you're
the
right.
film,
All right,
and
that's
you
fine.
still follow Jack.
I think that
and that's the only point that they're separated in the entire.
I think
movie.
that just convinced me that you guys are right on this one. But as I said, I'm pretty close.
But and I'll give him this for. I know you hate child actors usually, Scott, and
Indeed, I do.
I usually think that
I hate children in general.
I don't know. I don't hate them. I try to look at children actors with an open mind whenever they're in a movie. But I find that a lot of times they do kind of a poor job. I think in this film, the kid who plays Jack did a good job.
See, well, if I may make one point that
Good.
maybe you didn't think of, I just kind of made me think of it now. Having said that, it's that yes, in my personality, I do not enjoy the company of children. But that's because that's
Happy about that.
that's because they're not well formed enough to have a conversation. They just don't know enough about the world, which is the whole fucking point of this movie, in a sense, or a large
Right.
point of it.
Him
So
learning
it's
how to-
showing you from his perspective.
Yeah.
So in that, I can sort of respect it. He was supposed to be sheltered, therefore he was supposed to be confused. And if you don't, if children aren't the greatest actors ever, at least the framework of the story sort of like alleviated some of that.
Right.
Actually, there's another movie, I can't remember the name of it, but it's where like they find a kid in the wilderness or something like that, and they're trying to bring him back to.
Oh, the Jungle Book?
That's what I was just gonna say.
No.
I know, I stole Steve-O's joke there. That seems obvious, but I know that's not what you wanted. But
no, he does when he feels like a feral child at times with his long hair. And if this movie had stopped at the end of them being in the room, I would have hated this child actor.
yes.
However, his second half, which again I feel is a much
Well, he
superior
grew
half.
as a character, and again, I'm going to give credit to the writing more so. And if you want to do it the same character split, it's 60-40 writing and 40% acting on the child actor's part.
But nonetheless, he won me over in the end. And if I hate a child actor, to have him win me over during a movie, that is an impressive feat.
I think
certainly saying
you said something about
and without vomiting pea soup all over everything.
Yes, well,
to boot.
You described it before the pre discussion of this for this episode that he was in fact sufferable and not insufferable, which I think is the best thing to be said about it. And like I meant to make this joke earlier, so I'll make it real quickly right now before we move on. That being trapped in a small room with any child would be hell. Regardless of whether you're being held there against their will or not.
Well, speaking of Joy, since we did the protagonist, I thought she did a fine job too. Again, when they got out of the room, they were given more of a range of interaction with people and
right. They were allowed to grow. I think as
I actually think she did a great job. I'm not sure if Brie Larson is nominated for actress, but she should be.
Yes.
I think based on this.
Yeah, she did a terrific job in this.
And maybe this is style, but I still there were some nice little touches where you could. They didn't really mention it, but you could see she had bruises and so forth on her. So, anyways, I think regardless of all that, them being the main characters, whatever split you want to take it, that because of both the writing and yes, the strength of the acting, even having it being a kid was perfectly fine. I'll give it a 1.
I'll give it a 1 as well.
And I will also give it a 1. I enjoyed I also want to mention I enjoyed the bad tooth that she pulled out of her skull.
Okay, you like that
that
scene?
scene was pretty.
All right.
Pretty hardcore, and also kind of reminded me of Always Sunny.
All right, fine. It added a touch of realism.
Reminded me of last Wednesday. So, Scott, we're on to supporting characters.
That's not a movie, by the way.
All right. Well, check that one out either way. Yes, I'm on to secondary characters. So, we always like to start off with our grand tradition. This is a difficult one because they were all fine, actually. I didn't dislike any of them. It's almost like making an ensemble movie composed entirely in secondary characters aside from Joy and Jack, if that makes any sense to you guys. Even the doctor was fine and the cops were okay and all that. But, of course, I want to say that Seamus the dog was my favorite character. But that's just facetious. He didn't really have much to do with anything. It's just that, her family filled out, it's sort of, again, the repercussions of being reunited after you thought you'd lost your child for 7 years to being abducted, being kidnapped, and you have no idea what's been happening to her. Now that you find out what has happened, is that better or worse for being what happened?
I really like Seamus as well. Just the introduction of him was pretty great. But I do have to say that I thought that the mother, grandma or whatever, I don't think
they ever mentioned her name at all.
Her first name at all, but I thought she did a really good job, kind of being everything that she had
being
to
a
deal
grandmother
with
in
was
that situation,
super emotional, and I thought that the actress pulled it off well of not going overboard in the role.
Yes, I agree. I think everyone had if not a subtle performance, a very realistic portrayal of who their characters were supposed to be within the story.
Right.
I'm docking this 1 point for a waste of William H. Macy. So that's a penalty.
They shipped him on the bus.
Well, I think we said in the same sense that Bridge of Spies wasted Alan Alda. This movie kind of wasted him.
But I'm giving 2 points for Uncle Leo.
All right.
Because I actually, yes,
he was really good too.
Everyone did a fine job, but he actually stood out as an interesting character. And I'm looking at it from his perspective. I think they said he was a friend of the family before this had happened.
Yeah.
But could you imagine remarrying or living with a woman and then finding out that her
I imagine he knew that her daughter had been abducted.
Knew it, but
when coming back,
but her
having to
showing
deal
up
with
again,
that,
sure.
He handled that with a
plum.
Yes, and it was I like he was a neat character. I liked his interactions and trying to bring Jack out, and bring Seamus the dog along. So He won over the supporting cast for me.
You mentioned this earlier, and I'll bring it up here again. The interviewer, who interviewed Joy, I think we said represented like the media jackals essentially. That sure, it was like, it was supposed to be a compassionate primetime interview, but she was asking very tough, like unsettling questions, which of course led into the suicide attempt. So I thought that was a pretty good, again, realistic portrayal, because that's what you've definitely seen that in real life, where someone has been rescued from some kind of tragedy similar to this, or equal, and the media just immediately wants to latch onto them and throw them into the limelight so everyone can watch and like sort of be entranced by their trauma. And I think that the movie did a good job doing that, touching on that. So if not in themes, I think she might count as a vague supporting character.
Yeah.
There's also two more we didn't... Well, we mentioned one earlier.
Right.
Old Saint Nick.
Yeah.
So, again, I think he did a...
That was not his name in the film.
Old Nick.
Anyways.
I went on about him before, but I think the actor did a fine job portraying this kind of
real son of a bitch.
I felt that this guy...
Yeah, a believable, creepy kidnapper, sure.
Yeah.
And then there was the all-purpose Indian doctor.
Yeah, which we found a little bit odd, but...
All right, so he when they go to the hospital after they escape the room, he shows up, and it seems like he's the ER doctor and whatnot. But then it turns out he's the child psychologist. Or anyway, he appears later on in the house.
He's all doctors at all times, apparently.
All-purpose doctor.
Yeah.
So I think he was a pretty minor character, but...
He's a Swiss Army knife of doctors, apparently. But no, I mean, he did a fine job for however much time he was in the film.
It was very strange that he had that second scene as, I guess, the psychologist part of it, because he was there and it seemed to be kind of setting up some sort of future event for him, but he never came back after that.
Also, we'd be remiss not to talk about Jerkwad Cop.
Oh, yeah.
Not even less time, but
the guy who seemed like he was 3 days away from retirement just didn't give a damn anymore.
Hey, why don't we just drop the kid off
and give him some sleep first, then he'll be...
He was annoyed. He seemed annoyed about having to have rescue this captive child. He just wanted to go home to his coffee and donuts, apparently. But anyways, we were amused by that. It seemed a little bit odd, but again, it didn't break immersion or anything like that.
Yeah, no, it was fine.
So I'm giving it a 1. I enjoyed the supporting cast.
Yeah, I think they all did a good job of rounding it out. And I think the biggest description you can place upon them all is that it was very believable. So again, credit to the script and credit to the actors.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 1 as well. I have nothing bad to say about any of the supporting cast, to be honest.
All right, now I'm on to dialogue. And I don't know. I didn't cringe at
You want to
any
pass
of it.
for a second and maybe we can convince you, or go on,
talk
it through?
I'm going to pass.
Okay. Let me start off, try to convince you. I think I'm going to give it a good score for 2 reasons. As you just said, nothing was ever cringeworthy, or at least not cringeworthy in the sense that it was bad. Yeah. There was uncomfortable moments, but that was on purpose, and again, handled well.
Well, let me cut in for a moment.
Okay.
I think I didn't cringe, but I think both of you cringed right at the beginning.
Oh,
it's the kid's voiceover
right.
right at the beginning.
Child
you're
exposition.
Like, oh, this damn kid is like talking.
Child exposition sort of slow rolled me.
Yeah,
it was.
I think after that, you guys got into that.
Here, let me again split hairs, if you will. I didn't think the dialogue was bad. I thought his delivery, because he's a child, had it been an adult saying all those things, it would have been different, of course. Yeah. So I had a bias going into it, but again, let me try to make my point to try to convince E. Of why I think it was good, is that it was all very believable. No cringe. I believed every second of every moment that everyone was saying at all times.
Yes,
and they all did a good job of acting through it and delivering their lines and portraying the action when it called for when Joy was trying to explain to Jack about actual reality. Thought that was handled well. There are a whole bunch of moments I can name, and there are almost 0 moments I can name where I started to disbelieve or anything like that.
Actually, I want to. You reminded me during speaking of this one moment that I want to point out, because this again, the more I think about this movie, the more I realize how much of a craftsman the writer was.
Yep.
You focus so much on Jack that you forget that Joy is a teenager. She's 24
she's
now.
24, right? Yeah.
But she's still mentally...
Sure,
she went in when she was 17. She got kidnapped from high school.
That's a good point.
And when she is back at home with her mother, she
acts like a teenager,
exactly like a teenager for one scene. But the way it was handled was amazing, that you forget, because she has such a responsibility and trauma, that it aged her, but kept her static as well. It's such a brilliant...
That's an extremely good point. I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah, it was 100% believable, and in fact, it was a very impactful scene, perhaps even more so now having thought about it, that you brought it up. I 100% agree that she did, maybe, as I said, she was great in her role, and perhaps deserves even more credit than I thought on top of that, because, that seems to be how the script wanted her to do it, to act it out, and she did a great job with it. Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have that much more to say about the dialogue. I thought it was well done. It's not the type of movie that you're going to be going home and going back and quoting or anything like that. But all of the dialogue, it's not the point of it. There was never a moment in it that I thought that it seemed untrue to the film.
Yes.
And I think that's the best thing you can say about any dialogue in a movie.
For sure. Before we move on, I will add one thing, that I wish Seamus had more lines. But I am giving it a 1.
Agreeing 1 as well. So we are on to Style with Stephen Ramosi. That should be a new show, by the way.
Style. All right. So I mentioned earlier that I have 2 things to say about Style, and then I'll pass it off to you guys. I mentioned earlier that this film is really visceral. They make a point to almost make you feel what Jack is feeling as he's finding himself and finding out what the world is all about. And it's really done very well. You kind of almost go back to when you first, felt something, or
locked in a wardrobe in a garden shed.
Yes.
Go on.
No, but you kind of almost go back to like when you first learned how something new felt, or what, that type of
like I said, the childlike wonder / innocence / discovery.
And whoever the director is, I don't know who it is offhand, but whoever the director is and the cinematographer did a very good job of making that real. The second thing that I want to mention, and then I'll pass it off, is of course about the soundtrack, which I always have to mention. They did a very good job.
Soundtrack Steve-O, that should be the new show.
Exactly. They did a very good job with the leitmotif of the soundtrack, and every time there was kind of an emotional thing happening, they brought in this undercurrent of the same tune that you would hear, and it kind of
repeated melody. We'll call it.
It kind of brought you back to originally when they were locked up in the shed, and then you kind of think back along their path of getting away from that throughout the movie. I thought that did a very good job.
I agree with all that, and I just want to point out that the one that did it for me, in terms of style, that goes to speaks to what you said about visceral believability, I guess I'll call it, is when Jack is hiding in the rug in Old Nick's truck and trying to escape. And so many of the shots, sorry, I just preempted Ian, but I mean, it seems obvious to me that, he's, as he escapes from the rug and looks up at the world at large, he sees like everything, the sky and so forth, things he hasn't seen before. And it's disconcerting. It's it's confusing. It's overwhelming to him. I thought the way the cinematography for that was extreme. Like it portrayed the feeling of that, as you just said.
It made you feel.
Yeah, that was the moment for me, or at least that sequence spoke to me about that.
Yes. The director or cinematographer had a really interesting spatial eye for detail.
I like that very much.
Because again, you're dealing with this movie is a lot about scope. It's about how and your own boundaries in the world.
It's almost like the theme, kind of.
But the room, the fact that you see the room, which is Jack's entire world, then you see it at the end, stripped bare, door
exposed,
wide open,
looks small,
and he even says that.
By the way,
it looks
do you
much
guys
bigger.
See how small that damn wardrobe was at the end?
Yeah,
it looks so much bigger when you're in the beginning of the movie.
But that was the point.
Sure, but that's the point.
Yeah, and then the house. The way they deal with him living in this new environment, they do very close-up shots on very specific sections. I don't know. The guy was very clever melding theme and cinematography.
100%, I agree. And it's actually a known psychological thing in all. Think about when you were a kid, right? Think about your backyard or wherever you played, a playground you played in. You go back to it nowadays. you think to yourself, God, this place is so fucking small. But
Yeah,
when you were
yeah.
a kid, of course, your perspective was a lot different, so it seems larger in retrospect.
Absolutely.
So I think that like they use that use that effect to great effect in the movie itself.
And you mentioned earlier, Steve-O, that they really do shots to give you Jack's perceptions of the new world, but they also do it to show his failings in the new world. When he can't adapt to
When
the
he can't
light
understand
right away,
something, yeah, sure.
The lighting in the room kind of reflects that you get the sense
It's
of
off in some sense, yeah.
So I don't know. This is a very well crafted movie, and I think that's the best. It's brilliantly crafted.
I would agree with that
completely
description,
yeah.
and I think we're giving it a 1 here.
Yeah, I'm giving style a 1. Wow.
Okay, we're on to recommendation with Scott.
And I am on to recommendation. Yes, this is difficult. On the surface, I should say yes, I recommend it, but with the caveat that to say it's difficult subject matter. Like don't go into this movie thinking you're gonna have a good time, or you have to pay attention. You can't turn your mind off, and perhaps you have to be at a certain level in order to be prepared to absorb what they're about to show you.
Right.
But I still think, given everything we just said, especially style, especially the portrayals, that it was extremely well done on many fronts. And just if you're going to see it, I would say to people, hey, should I see it? Yes, but be prepared to not be uplifted about life necessarily.
Right.
But I think it is uplifting, though.
Right. It has it tries to put a positive spin, or at least a hopeful little note at the end of the movie. Sure, that's true, but nevertheless, you have to get through some pretty serious stuff. You might be somewhat traumatized yourself by seeing this movie about the repercussions and portrayals of trauma. But regardless, this sort of perhaps broadly relates to a number of other movies we reviewed in this season, that, it deals with not necessarily the most uplifting, positive subject matter, but perhaps is an important thing to address within culture and society. So, given all that, like I said, I will recommend it, but with that caveat. That's all.
Steve, what's your recommendation?
Well, I think I'm going to be of a similar mind. If somebody was like, hey, I got a couple hours this afternoon, what should I watch? I wouldn't say go watch Room.
It's not a lighthearted movie.
But
Ernie said.
Would you recommend The Room?
Maybe.
No.
You know what? Yes, I would. I would say if
that circumstance,
if those couple of hours are going to be very drunken couple of hours, definitely watch The Room because it's hilarious. But as far as Room goes, what I would say is maybe put aside some time where you're ready to get into something like this, because it's a heavy movie, and especially the first half of it is really messed up. There's a lot of
it's uncomfortable. That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. But through that, I think the overall point of this movie, when you get to the end of it, is that even though someone has been through that, you can still get to a point of acceptance of your life and
moving forward
on.
Yes.
And that being said, I think this is a really well done movie in that vein, and I would recommend it. Although, again, like you said, Scott, I would probably warn people that you have to be in.
You basically have to take it.
You have to give yourself. You have to put yourself in the right.
You have to take it with a grain of salt.
I agree with you guys that it is a difficult movie. Although it's not really a difficult movie to watch. I don't think they really do. It's tough thematically, but it isn't necessarily overwhelms
You're
you
right.
with.
That's a good description. Sure.
Yeah, it's not with intensity of the situation. It's more of the heavy emotion. And I think, again, the second half, I think, touches upon that a lot more when you see the repercussions versus the actual acts of it. Now, when I first came out of this movie, I didn't dislike it, but I didn't have as high of an opinion of it as I do now, having talked about it and having thought about it. And this is a very great movie when you're in the mood to consider.
Or when you're ready to handle it, I would say.
It's the difference between this is a craft work. This is not something lighthearted enjoyment. And I could see a lot of people not liking this, as I guess I'm reiterating what you guys are saying. So I have to give it a recommendation because to the people who are into film.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I'm going to say 100% give it credit on that front. But of course, like, it's not a popcorn movie. which is what most people in broadly go to movies to see. It's not a turn off your mind and be entertained kind of movie.
If someone wants to go see a movie, this isn't a movie. This is a film.
Yeah,
and this is a clear distinction between what the difference between those are.
Yeah, so, I'm not going to split hairs, but we're basically agreeing with each other while rephrasing it, and we're recommending it. It seems.
So, for the second time this
bust out your calculator.
Season, we have given the movie a 10,
which I agree. Just my final closing off is that I wasn't sure. I didn't think I would give this movie as high of a score as I did, but having thought and talked about it as we just have, I think it does deserve the score we just gave it.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think this is a movie, as you just said, that got better after watching it and thinking
upon
about
reflection
it and talking about it. So
yeah, going back to recommendation for a second. If you're into movie or if you're into film, gather some of your intellectual friends together, watch this movie, and then have a good discussion about it. And I think that's the best way to enjoy this movie. Or have a discussion with us. Leave a comment.
Sure.
All right, so I'm Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Scott Dilla.
I want to see The Room 2 Legend of Seamus's Gold.
And Stephen Hermosi.
Have a good night.
We'll see you next time for the MOTScars.
This has been Bon Mots. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Music by Chris Morgan. Editing and engineering by Stephen Hermosi. This has been a Lost Signals production. All rights reserved.